Michael Reynolds, welcome to AhvalTV.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Michael Reynolds is an associate professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. He is expert on Ottoman history as well as Russian and Eurasian history. I think these expertise areas are very much related to today's Turkey, as Turkey is getting cozier in relations with Russia. And Michael Reynolds also is known as a frequent commentator on Turkish issues for international media as well as American media. Let me go right into my first question without taking much of your time. It is now third week that Turkey's Afrin operation launched. What is your assessment almost after 3 weeks Turkey began, whether its military or political goals?
Well, first I should preface my remarks by making the point that I have no access to any special information. All I know about the Afrin operations, what I can read in the media, this the American media, Turkish, Russian. So I have no special insights into precisely what's going on there. So having prefaced my remarks, I would say it seems so far the campaign has been very inconclusive. Which I don't think would surprise most military analysts. They would not have expected that Turkey, for example, would have been able to simply rout the YPG and drive them out of northern Syria in a matter of weeks. Instead, it looks like it will be something. I don't want to use the word quagmire. That's so often overdone. But so far, what we see is an inconclusive campaign. And I think particularly after the downing of the Russian jet. And the closing of the airspace to the Turkish Air Force, that's going to make it much more difficult for Turkey to achieve any sort of decisive military victory, if that's what Turkey is looking for. Now, maybe part of the reason going into Afrin was not so much that Ankara isn't thinking, well, we're going to achieve a decisive military victory, defeat the YPG, and settle our problem. I would hope that the decision makers in charge of this operation realize that the problem they face with the YPG and then with the PKK is a much bigger one and is not going to be resolved anytime soon, and certainly not with military force alone. So perhaps one of the reasons why this operation was undertaken to placate popular opinion, that's never usually a good reason to do these things, but the other one would be to send perhaps a signal to the Americans: we are very serious when we say that we see the YPG as a threat, and we will act in defense of Turkey. If that's the intention, I think they have sent that message, but the big question, I am doubtful that Washington has received it.
Okay, so let me transition from here to Manbij, also to follow up with your latest remark. So after Afrin, apparently the Manbij is a very hot spot. Just yesterday, top American generals visited there and sent pretty clear, straight messages that Americans are staying in Manbij. So, what is your expectation with regards to Manbij? What are the options going forward?
No, that's an excellent question. And so as I mentioned in my previous answer, that it's not, I don't know that Washington, if Turkey was trying to send the message to Washington by going into Afrin, it was trying to signal to Washington, we're really very serious about countering the YPG, and we will take up arms, we will intervene inside of Syria. And if the idea was to shake up Washington and get them to reconsider their stance on Turkey and say, okay, look, we understand your concerns. Let's try to work together to resolve this problem. It seems like, if anything, the American response has been the opposite. Rather than seeking to accommodate Turkey, has been much more aggressive. And that is precisely the response that the generals in Manbij gave, which is, we're here, don't you dare try to strike us. And the unstated, or maybe even was a stated message, was that if we are attacked, we will, that is, the Americans will fight back. This is really extraordinarily a dangerous situation. That is, I see both sides, both in Turkey and the U.S., are escalating both in the rhetoric and in their military deployments. And it's extremely volatile situation. I hope cooler heads will prevail, but I don't see much evidence of that happening.
So as we speak, actually, just a couple of minutes ago, finally, the State Department confirmed that Secretary of State Tillerson is indeed going Ankara. They have not confirmed before. Also, the McMaster, National Security Advisor of White House, is expected to go. That visit has not confirmed yet. What would be these top officials' messages to Ankara? How can they convince Turkish president not to, come near to Manbij, as well as, end the Afrin operation as soon as possible, which it seems like there was a Washington position right now?
I think there'd be two possible options. One would be to deliver a message, a very stern message, that basically, if you do something like that, America will retaliate. That the response might be, don't test us, we will challenge your forces militarily. I hope that's not the message they're seeking to bring, because that, again, is a disaster for the U.S., and it would be a disaster for Turkey, it'd be a disaster for NATO overall, to have two NATO allies actually now using force against each other. So that's one possibility. They might send a message, try to intimidate, essentially, Ankara. I think there is one of the unfortunate things in the American side is that there is a good deal of a good deal of emotion is driving American policy, as it is on Turkish. It's both sides, and I think that stems from the failures of both Turkish foreign policy and the failure of American foreign policy over the last 15 years, and it's a good deal of frustration coming out on both sides. And rather than recalibrating their foreign policies and asking themselves, what are we doing wrong, both Turks and Americans? Instead, it seems like both are blaming each other for their problems. So this is definitely a trend that's been going on. I think you can definitely see that in the American military officers and some of their comments, and I think more of this comes out of the Pentagon. That's my impression. Tillerson, I do think is a diplomat, not a professional one, but I think he, by nature, is a diplomat. And so my hope is that the message will be a much more conciliatory, maybe is not the right word, but one that would be a cooperative one. That is, we understand you guys are face a threat from the PKK and YPG. We don't want to see this expand. Let's work together. But the problem, the fundamental problem with, I think, both the Turkish foreign policy and American foreign policy, neither really has any sort of strategy to grapple with the questions, the challenges that face them. America's is basically, again, looking over the last 15 years or so, American foreign policy, I think, has revealed itself in the Middle East to be bankrupt. We've achieved precisely the opposite of the sorts of things that we're hoping to achieve. One of my hopes is that Trump was going to initiate some sort of major rethinking of American foreign policy. That doesn't seem to be the case. American foreign policy seems to be running on sort of an autopilot. So we are not thinking 5 steps down the road, but at best 1 or 2 steps. So we're in Syria to make sure that ISIS doesn't return. That's an understandable goal. And the other is, I think, to block Iran. There's a great deal of concern about that. That is also perhaps a laudable goal, but none of it comes at the cost of destroying our relations with Turkey. And that's what we seem to be doing right now. And I don't think we're really thinking very, that is America, is thinking very far down the road. Likewise, I think Turkey, in grappling with the problem of the PKK, the YPG, is also not thinking 5 steps down the road, but is let itself get trapped into reacting to immediate threats, and this is leading it now to destroy its relations with the United States.
Do you think of anything that Americans can propose Turkey? I mean, it seems like the Americans are going to stay with Syrian Kurds because there is nobody else in Syria. Americans want to stay in Syria for forcible future to encounter Iranian influence and, Russians. I don't have any answer. What can Americans propose to convince Ankara? Do you have anything in your mind?
I think that's really the nub of the problem right there. That is, if the United States is determined that yes, we're going to remain in Syria because we need to counter Iran, we need to ensure ISIS is fully defeated, and this idea that we're going to also tangle with Russia. It's difficult to see what an American can do otherwise. I mean, we could again try to give some sorts of assurances to Turkey that we will perhaps establish some sort of corridor or something to prevent any YPG attacks into Turkey. How believable, how credible would such guarantees be to Ankara? I think right now they would not be all that credible. And that's leaving aside the technical aspects that could in fact America establish any sort of corridor. That would be a huge diversion of resources for the United States. And then there's the question: would Ankara believe it?
Yeah.
And, frankly, as an American, I'm stunned to see the level of cooperation that we've developed with the YPG, knowing that this is a group that is dedicated, essentially sworn enemies of Turkey. And I'm in some ways, unlike some Americans are furious how dare Turkey take these operations that it has. In some ways, I'm amazed that it's taken Turkey so long to react this way, which isn't to say the reaction is to Turkey's benefit, but I certainly understand it. I think really what an American needs to do is to sort out what in the world it's trying to do in Syria and maybe come to the realization that it can't achieve the goals that it is trying. If the idea is we're going to be in Syria in order to counter Iranian influence and Russian influence, how we're going to do that by converting Turkey into a hostile power, I don't see. And I think our policies and our following in Syria are not in the interest of the United States, and are actually counterproductive to what our goals are in the region.
My final question. I try to ask this question to every Turkey expert we host here. How do you assess Turkey-US relations? Some say it is beyond repairment point. Some appear to be having still some hopes that Turkish-US relations come back to normal at some in the future. What's your assessment?
I don't think they're yet at a total breaking point. But I mean, clearly they're going in that direction, and I would see that if we can't rule out right now that there's going to be an armed clash between Turkish forces and American. That might be provoked by some elements of allied with Turkey inside of Syria, or elements of the opposition to Assad. It could be the YPG perhaps could provoke something that gets Americans and Turks shooting at each other. Or it might be something that the Turkish military, the American military does quite deliberately. All those things, unfortunately, that's all too easy to imagine right now. If that happens, I think then you might be at the point where there's no return. And another big fear of mine had been when America some years back began arming the YPG. I thought, what is this going to happen with the YPG, the PKK starts using those weapons inside of Turkey to kill Turks? Yeah. That would be the equivalent. I try to explain this to Americans. Imagine if Turkey was arming Al-Qaeda affiliates inside of Mexico, and they were crossing into the border and carrying out attacks inside of America. How would Americans see that? And if you could imagine that the number of people that we lost in 9/11 was something like 10 times the number, the American public would be like the Turkish public today, would be absolutely outraged. I think there is still a recognition, I hope there is, among some people in the American government and in the Turkish government, that both countries have benefited a great deal from their alliance, their cooperation in the past. What alarms me, at least, is on the American side. I can see there is a good deal of, again, I think it comes out more out of emotion, frustration with Turkey, because American policy in the Middle East has not gone as Americans had hoped. Our policies in Syria have not succeeded as we hoped. And I think to some extent, there's a tendency to blame, pour the blame for this onto Turkey. There is an attitude towards Turkey among some circles in the United States is really genuinely hostile. And unfortunately, they're fooling themselves by making Erdogan the focus of their ire. Certainly, Erdogan is not the best face for Turkey right now. Just to take this small example, his visit to Washington was absolutely disgraceful. The skirmishing, the fighting, the kicking of people that his bodyguards did, I mean, kicking people on the ground, is absolutely the worst possible image that Turkey could give to Americans and to the world. And that, unfortunately, a lot of Americans see that, okay, that is Turkey. What they don't understand, one, that's not Turkey, and they also don't understand that what's going on, Turkey's policies in Syria really should surprise anyone with any familiarity with Turkey. If you didn't have Erdogan, I think almost any other leader would be doing that. And of course, we see there, even the opposition to Erdogan has been strongly in support. I don't think Americans fully understand that. We've somehow convinced ourselves the problem is Erdogan, the problem is Erdogan's an Islamist, and if he weren't there, everything would be different, and that's just not the case.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This has been a very informative and very good angle on Turkish-US relations, and I think very realistic one. And we are going to continue watching Turkey-US relations and trying to bring the expertise voices like Michael Reynolds from Princeton University. Again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.